Hi, my name is Mattia Murray, and welcome to The Longer Road. You are on the longer road if you have multiple intersectional identities that are often marginalized. You've had to work harder to get to the starting line, and you might feel behind. I'm here to provide hope, support, and practical tips, and to let you know that you're not alone. Hello. Today I'm talking about boundaries and how I was terrible at them for a really long time and how I now use them to support my own safety and healing. Here's a definition of boundaries from a dictionary. Something that indicates a border or limit, the border or limit so indicated, that which serves to indicate the bounds or limits of anything. I love that it brings in borders in the definition because to me, the border between two countries is one of the most extreme types of boundaries. And for many years, an extreme boundary, such as no contact, which I talked about last week, was the only type of boundary I knew how to keep because I felt like I could only make a boundary in an extreme situation, and I only trusted myself to enforce a boundary that was extreme. And if you want to hear more about why I'm no contact with my parents, despite doing a lot of personal forgiveness work, that's what I talked about last week. Also, according to the dictionary, boundarylessness is a word. So, how do we create personal boundaries that are somewhere between the boundary of a country, the most extreme it could be, and total boundarylessness? My favorite definition of personal boundaries is that it's what you will do if someone else crosses your boundary. An ultimatum would be creating the line and then saying to the other person, "You may not cross this line. Do not do it." And if you've ever used ultimatums, you know they don't typically work. Boundaries don't actually require you to tell the other person what's happening. You can just do your own thing and maintain the boundary on your own. Though, as I'll get to later, if the goal is to build a healthier relationship with that person and you do have some trust, you may want to talk to them about it so they can learn how to support you. The basic purpose of boundaries, as I understand it, is self-protection. It's saying that if someone else is treating you badly or doing something you don't want to be around, you're going to take action to protect yourself. And this doesn't have to be about abuse on the other person's part. It can also be things that are triggering based on your past or just overwhelming your sensory system. Anything you do to protect yourself and protect your mind-body system could be considered a boundary. I'm going to start with an example of when I used boundaries really badly and incorrectly, and it did not work. My PTSD and complex PTSD probably peaked in about 2012 when I was getting out of an abusive relationship. The next person I dated after that was really understanding about triggers and really tried to be good with it, but I kept finding new triggers. I kept finding triggers I didn't know I had. So I couldn't ask this person not to do these things ahead of time because I didn't know they were there until something would happen and bring it up. So when I was living with this person in a small apartment, in my head, it made sense for the boundary to be never trigger me. I now recognize that's both impossible and not really a boundary. It was more of an ultimatum. And I know it was an ultimatum because what I was really implying was never trigger me or else. I wasn't doing anything to protect myself. I was just lashing out when this person did trigger me periodically. And this was a while ago, but if I'm remembering correctly, they actually did a pretty good job of not doing the same triggers again once we found a new one. But I would get so angry when I would find a new one if it was something they did that I felt triggered me. I was also during this time having pretty regular autistic meltdowns and migraines and chronic pain, and I was just generally really overwhelmed. And I was in grad school, so it was just a rough time. Looking back, if I had known more about boundaries and understood more about what my system was going through, I might have tried something more like this. If I get triggered, I'm going to go to a safe space in the apartment and self-soothe. And later we can talk about what the trigger was to try to avoid it in the future. And also maybe part of the solution would have been tracking those triggers to take them to my therapist to work on, for example. So those would all be an example of my response to protect myself as opposed to what I was actually doing a decade ago, which was just to become very upset when I was triggered and not really have a process and not really have a way to protect myself. Part of the reason boundaries were hard for me to figure out is that I didn't grow up with them at all. My parents don't believe in bodily autonomy and they don't really believe in boundaries. I never saw boundaries modeled, let alone healthy boundaries. I only knew the coping mechanisms of fight and flight. Another reason boundaries were hard for me is that the hard part is never just setting the boundary. Coming up with it in our own head is the easy part. The hard part is keeping it once you make it. In the moment, when tension is high, when your nervous system is activated, when you're feeling that adrenaline, the easiest thing is to default to your habits, which is what you've done before, what's worked for you before. And those are not always the healthiest responses. We default to what our body has learned is safe and is going to keep us safe. And when you start enforcing boundaries, it absolutely does not feel safe at first, unless you've seen it modeled in a healthy way. Even with people who feel safe, it just feels unnatural and wrong, or at least it did to me. And just learning to say no was a big deal for me. So back at the beginning when I talked about borders and no contact, that type of boundaries, that's really all I knew how to do. Those were the only boundaries that felt both important enough for me to get behind and to have my own back and to actually enforce. And I've thought many times over the years, and this is kind of a fucked up thought, but I'm kind of glad my parents are so comically villainous because it makes them so much easier to cut out of my life. So I don't have to deal with complex boundaries with them. If they were more normal people that were not so evil, I might have to actually deal with a lot of that stuff. And in a way, I'm glad that it's been easy to not. So then when I started having more complex situations relating to people, times where there was no abuse that made me feel like I needed to cut them out, more like, as an example, people diving into talking about their own trauma in graphic detail without asking me if it was okay first. Stuff like that. That's not abusive, it's just triggering, or can be. Definitely not malicious, definitely something we can talk about, and I have brought that up with people when this has happened. And it can be even smaller than that. People might be doing something very innocuous, but I'm experiencing sensory overload, and so I'm having a hard time with it. And that's just me. That's just my system. What do you do in those situations when people are not being bad or wrong or abusive, but it's just not working for you and it's feeling difficult? I go back to that idea that boundaries are really about self-protection. How can I protect myself and be safe in this situation? So with the example of sensory overload, I have multiple tools that I carry with me at most times to protect my ears and my eyes if I need to. And if I do that and it's still too much, I might ask people to reduce the input, for example, to talk quieter or turn the music down or off. And if I don't feel comfortable asking, or if it's still too much after they've done that, I'll just remove myself from the situation temporarily or permanently. And other than asking someone to change the volume or lighting or whatever, all of the rest of that is stuff I can do on my own and to take care of myself. Or I'm thinking of an example at a social gathering where I reached a sensory wall really quickly, and I said to my partner, I need to go now. I needed to walk out the door in the next 60 seconds, basically. And if they had not wanted to leave with me, I would have just gone home on my own, which really would have been totally fine. And an ultimatum would have been saying that they had to come with me, which I did not say because I was really fine going on my own if I needed to. The boundary to protect myself was that I needed to leave because of the sensory overwhelm, and I was just letting them know. So that was a boundary versus an ultimatum. And in that case, just letting them know, having that heard, and having that said out loud. Sometimes when I say things out loud, it helps my brain get them or really accept that it's happening or integrate or something. Just saying it out loud helped me feel calmer because I knew I was in the process of taking action to protect myself, and my system got that message. For boundaries when someone is being a problem, here are a couple more examples. One early boundary I set with my parents was that I would not continue the conversation if they were yelling at me. I just started walking away, hanging up the phone, etc. I did not tell them that I was planning to do this. I think it was pretty clear from my actions what was happening. And it was very freeing to me and started to give me that sense of safety that I could support myself and have my own back, even in this stressful situation. And this is a relatively small one, but now that I'm back on social media after I had taken a break from it, I block people anytime I feel the need to. Almost all of them are strangers in groups who post terrible things that I have no interest in arguing with or trying to educate them around it. Every once in a while I will. I'm usually more willing to do the educational type work if it's someone who I'm in relationship with or a friend of a friend or something like that. But, for example, I have gotten some posts and videos that have gotten the attention of extremists, and I've gotten hate comments and even a couple light death threats, and I just block those people. If a close friend posted something really upsetting, I would give them the benefit of the doubt more, most likely, depending on what it was, and check in with them and see what's up. But for the people at the periphery of my social circle or just random strangers, the way I protect myself through a boundary is by permanently unseeing that person's content forever. And it has made my online experience much more manageable. If setting and maintaining boundaries is tough for you, first of all, know that that's true for a lot of people, and especially people with a trauma history, and especially people with marginalized identities who are used to being gaslit and not treated well and not given the same respect. So knowing that you're having a very normal experience, here are a few things you can try around boundaries. You can ask yourself, how would I support and protect myself if I were unafraid of the consequences? How would I have my own back if I were unafraid of the consequences? This is not to ignore that there may be real consequences. You can still think about those things later, but just as a thought exercise, how would you protect yourself? What would your boundaries be? Who would you be in contact with? What would your life look like? All of these things, if you completely had your own back and you were completely supporting and protecting yourself. A second thing you can do is practice saying no. This is probably more powerful with another person, but you can totally do it in the mirror. And if this feels very high stakes, I would try it in the mirror first and then ask someone to do it with you. I did this with a client this week who was feeling pressure to let a partner come over when they asked, even if she didn't really want them to. So I repeatedly asked, can I come over? And she kept answering no. And at first she was using excuses and then worked up to just saying no and letting that be a full sentence. And that was bringing up strong reactions in her body. So we noticed those, kind of looked for what they felt like, in this case, color, pressure, texture. What was that feeling that was coming up? What would feel better instead? And taking a moment to let that sensation in the body change to the thing that feels better. That's a metaphoric example rather than working with feeling words that can work really quickly. And then we just kept practicing until that no felt neutral. A third idea is you can create a teeny tiny boundary for yourself that you can enforce all on your own that doesn't involve another person. For example, you could decide that if you receive an upsetting message, you will put your phone down or walk away from the computer or whatever it is for 30 seconds before responding, and do something loving to yourself for those 30 seconds. That's just an example. You could set a boundary that if you hear a loud noise, you will cover your ears. Anything that feels like self-protection counts, and you can make it as small as you want. Making it something small to practice with will lower the stakes and maybe make it a little easier. And then just notice what comes up when you do that, when you actually follow through and you're building that self-trust, what comes up for you. And then fourth, because I know memory can be an issue, you might want to try writing your boundaries down as you're practicing them and reviewing them before situations where you think they might come up. So if you've set a boundary around something in a conversation, you might want to have that next to your phone or carry it with you so that you can just read what your boundary is before you go into the situation, just to remind yourself. A few more thoughts on boundaries. You can use secret temporary boundaries whenever you're having a tough time. I do this all the time with the partner that I live with, not because they're doing anything wrong, but if I'm having a tough day or a tough week, I will use these boundaries where I'm just taking extra time for myself and giving myself extra space. I don't have to ask them for it. It's just a personal thing. And they've actually almost never noticed when I'm doing this. They just assume that I'm busy. And yes, I can ask for support directly if I need it, but in this case, the support that I need is space. So I just take that for myself. And I've just found that for me, it's easier to just do that and take the space I need and get recharged and feel better rather than tell them, being around you stresses me out right now, because I find people don't like to hear that a whole bunch. You're allowed to create and change boundaries whenever you want. It's okay if other people don't like or agree with your boundaries. They're for you and your protection. If you want sort of one big meta boundary, it could be that you protect and take care of yourself, whatever that looks like in the moment. It may be useful to periodically check in with the boundaries you do have and ask yourself, are they really about safety or are they about discomfort? You're allowed to set whatever boundaries you want, but sometimes when your safety is increasing over time, we still default to old boundaries that aren't as needed anymore. And that's related to this next idea, which is a huge topic I'm not going to dive into in great detail right now, But one issue with privilege is that sometimes protecting yourself means causing harm. And particularly I see this in activist and artist spaces where white people are, quote, setting boundaries that end up harming Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are in the same space. So that idea of safety versus discomfort, sometimes when we're uncomfortable, and especially as white people, we've been told that our discomfort is the same as being unsafe, and we take action accordingly. I don't want you to use this idea against yourself by not setting healthy boundaries if you need to, but just notice who's on the other side of the boundary. Do you have more privilege than them in different ways? And if you're ever unsure about whether your boundaries are turning into this negative thing, you could speak to a friend or mentor about it, or do some journaling or thinking about the impact that it's having and whether you're truly unsafe or just uncomfortable. Boundaries don't have to be perfect. They definitely don't have to be permanent. And the more you increase your own sense of safety and your own sense of self-trust, your boundaries very likely will change over time. To close out, I want to share what robust boundaries look like in my life right now. So not the exact boundaries I have, but what those boundaries are doing for me. All of my relationships feel safe and balanced. I always know I will have my own back no matter what happens. I very rarely gaslight myself, and when I do find myself gaslighting myself, I'm able to reset and return to supporting myself, usually pretty quickly. The people close to me know my important boundaries and sometimes help me enforce them if I need that. And I'm able to communicate much more easily because I've created safe ways for me to do so and to rest and to take care of myself around difficult conversations. So it's not perfect. It's definitely still a work in progress, but protecting myself through boundaries and using healthy boundaries that are really around my safety and not just my discomfort have made it much more clear to me which relationships are healthy and which relationships really need some work. Because if you set a boundary in a healthy way, if you set it gently and communicate around it, and someone just has absolutely no interest in supporting you or allowing that boundary to stand, there might be something else there that you need to figure out. So the people that I've kept in my life close to me are the people that respect my boundaries. They may not always be happy about it, but that's not necessary. I don't need them to give me anything in particular. It's just about protecting my own energy and sense of self and maintaining that self-trust. I know this is a huge topic, so if there's anything else you would like to hear around this, I would love to hear from you, and I hope you have a great week. I'll see you next Friday. Thanks for listening. If you know someone who would be helped by this podcast, please share it with them. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions at mattia@mattiamurray.com. That's MATTIA at MATTIAMAUREE.com. Thank you.